got killed by 10 million pounds of sludge from New York and New Jersey.
All right, we are live. I had to play some music from one of my favorite bands from the Boston area. I believe you're in, Nelson. How you doing?
That's right. Today? I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, glad to finally have you, man. I notice you're always. I feel like we're always at the same, listening into the same like podcasts or webinars or.
I'm a long-time shit poster and have not gone on anything before, but
sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm honored. I'm honored to be the first for you to come on, and I think I can certainly relate, being a shit poster at times myself, for better or worse. But again, welcome, and man, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us your backstory. I know you're at site level, but tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah. So I am a lawyer, and I was in law school, my last year of law school in 2011. And my father, a psychiatrist, called me and said, son, I've been spending 59 hours a week doing clinical practice and 1 hour a week on research. And looks like I'm making more money doing research than in the 59 hours I was running a clinical practice. And I have to close it down. Drug companies are mad at me, worried about the government, could use your help shutting down this business. So I was working in a law firm that defended drug companies that were promoting their drugs off-label, and had some small understanding of what clinical trials were, and had planned to do something in the pharmaceutical industry for a legal career. So I helped my father shut down his research site, which was Atlantic Clinical Trials, I think, and learned about the industry from that. He had screwed up, every piece of documentation one can screw up. Consents were done improperly, and I mean, nothing nefarious was going on, but there's, when an IRB makes you have every page have an initial, he'd have, in every consent there would be one page with initials missing, right?
Sure.
Just sloppy things along those lines. And I helped. Too many companies were frustrated with him, even though, like most doctors starting out in research with a really big clinical practice, he had loads of patients to put into studies. So anyways, helped him close it. And then we talked afterwards and said, if I had handled the paperwork and he did the medical, we could make something of this. And he got the naming rights and wanted to go earlier in the alphabet than Atlantic. And Apple was already taken. So we settled on Adams.
Nice.
And that's sort of the story there.
Nice. So, I mean, even now today, what types of studies you guys run? Like, are you guys? My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you tend to be sort of a lower study volume, but more focused on enrolling well in the studies you do take. Is that fair?
It's fair. In for the first 4 years I ran the site, I think we ran it the same way every other site runs things. They're looking for every trial they can possibly get their hands on. My father's a psychiatrist, so I was looking for trials in psychiatry, but there were plenty of studies where they'd take internists or to work on them. So it wasn't, exclusively psych. And we took one trial in the 2015 or so for participants with moderate to severe heroin addiction, opiate use disorder. And it was unusual. It's a bit of an unusual trial. I actually paid one of those study brokers who found it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And InSearch, Chris Hieronymus from InSearch found it and paid a flat fee up front, like $12,000 for finding this study. And PIs wouldn't take it and the sponsor was sort of flipping out that they couldn't find any doctors to take it, because when people with opiate use disorder are in your waiting room, they steal your K-cups, right? And
Right.
steal your toilet paper, and they cause fights. And it scared off the old white male PI team from taking on any of these trials. But my father had been treating people with opiate use disorder for decades, and was really comfortable with the population. So we went ahead with it. And what I discovered in that program was sort of eye-opening for me. It taught me a lot about the whole industry, but I hadn't thought about what's the thing holding back sites from growing or from being bigger companies and more successful companies. And it became obvious in that trial that the thing holding back sites typically is their ability to recruit participants. And if there were an unlimited supply of participants, sites would be different sorts of businesses. But a huge portion of what sites do, and by far the limiting piece of why they have failed to grow, is that they can't find people so easily. But in this trial, there was no recruitment. We had people showing up and asking if their 4 friends could be in the study.
Right.
So we enrolled very quickly and had to call the sponsor and tell them we were voluntarily ceasing to screen anymore because we didn't want anyone to die. This was a placebo-controlled study in people with moderate to severe heroin addiction.
Yeah, that's rough.
And there were overdoses left and right, and people had to sit on the floor of our waiting room because we ran out of chairs most times a day. And I did what most sites, I think, would do in that situation, but I hadn't done before. I paid about $400 a day and had pizzas and or Chinese food in a room for people to eat. And I paid a cab company to pick up and drop off every participant. And the sponsor wouldn't cover these sorts of things, but it made a lot of sense for me to cover the cost, even to the point where I think I spent $400,000 on taxis in 1 year of this trial. But we ended up making more money from running the trial than all the trials we had done prior put together times 5.
Sure.
And we had an FDA inspection, and just about the only area I was comfortable and thought I knew something about in the industry was regulatory. So we had a successful FDA audit with no action. And it convinced me, why have I been running 15, 20 trials at the same time or more? I could just run one, because sites are paid for their costs plus overhead. And only a tiny percentage of their money comes from these startup associated costs or closeout.
Right.
I could make more just by doing one trial at a time. And I started doing that in psychiatry. We ended up taking really 2 trials in psychiatry and no others for many years until 2018 2018, and then took on a third trial. And then in 2019, we had a sort of interesting problem. All three companies we worked with had said to us, I had maybe 15 people working at the site, most of which, 12 of which were coordinators, right? They said, we are seeing you enroll much faster than the other sites. And that's a little alarming to us because although we're trying to go quickly, this is unusual. And I'd say to them, well, we're running 3 studies here. Typical sites are running 30.
Right.
So we're actually getting the same number of participants as all the other sites. They're just being concentrated into a few trials. And I had the nice backhanded compliment from J&J once. They said, we've reviewed your data. We're comfortable with you recruiting up to 25% of our sample in this program. But the whole team discussed it. And we think that you're not doing anything special. The other sites are just understaffing. Right. But in 2019, all 3 companies we were working with decided to cap our enrollment almost simultaneously. One of the studies closed, the other 2 capped it. And I realized that just having 3 studies, which is the fear of a lot of sites, wasn't sufficient. So we went up to about running 4 studies, not so huge of a difference. But the main innovation was that companies seemed to not be uncomfortable with us getting more than 10, 15% of their phase 3. The issue was that the FDA looks at data by PI, not by site. So if I were to have a second site, even if it were a block away, with a different PI and a different staff, then they'd be comfortable with us getting twice as many participants.
Right.
So we created that in 2020. And so now I sort of have 2 sites in the Boston area, and they run the exact same trials. And we're much higher enrolling in those trials than any other site because we don't have other jobs. And that's basically been the model. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to only working on very few trials.
Sure. So, yeah, okay, you've touched on so many things I find really interesting. To your point, I think it's, and I still suffer from this. It's, okay, let's get all the trials we can get, right? Knowing by now that, 60%, maybe 80%, they're going to be they're going to limp along. They're going to do kind of a half-assed job, right? And hopefully 20%, 10% are going to be those game changers that, help get us up over the plateau and kind of, to the next level where we can continue to build some infrastructure underneath, continue to grow out a little bit. Sounds like you've, found a really beautiful balance. I agree with you 100%. And, I guess what we do is not different, but unfortunately you burn a lot of bridges along the way by being like, you know what, we have 10 studies, but these 2 are great. The 8 other studies suck. So we're going to just give up on those. We're going to focus all our attention on these 2. You
even burn bridges just turning down studies. Right. So right. I think we sort of famously as sites here that when if a drug company asks you to work on a trial, so the WCG just had a figure last week. They were pitching their new product to help with getting sites to answer their feasibilities. Okay. And they said, sponsors, we know only for every 100 feasibilities you send out, only 20 to 25 even get a response. We have amazing data and contacts. We can get you 50 responses. Okay? And, I think sites should realize sites are horrible, right? How bad is that? People can't even believe it outside of this industry. But when I reply to feasibilities and I answer yes, I'm interested in the trial, and then I ultimately don't take it. Sites used to get told, and I think they still do, you will never be penalized for not taking a trial that you don't think is a good fit for you. You will be penalized if you take one and you fail to perform, right? But not if you turn one down. Well, I had IQVIA directly tell me once, the reason they wouldn't send me any more studies is because I turned down too many trials they'd offered to me.
I've heard that from others. Yeah.
So I'm happy to name the name, right? But so now I'm established enough in psychiatry and neurology now that I really just deal directly with pharma to find out about studies. And I'm so niche that I don't sort of need to know about the whole world of trials. But it's an interesting game sites have to navigate out there.
It is. And for me, building out my network, I've always felt like diversity is the name of the game. Just because, to your point, it being so much feels opportunistic. You know what I mean? Like whatever's available at the time is what's available at the time. I don't know what's going to come around the corner or not be around that corner. So I've fallen victim many times to the, more is more. Give them. But I guess how do you? It sounds like, anyways, you've got a great track record of making the good choices, and I think it can be challenging given the oftentimes little information that we may have across different steps of the way. How do you make that decision as to what is truly a good fit versus what's a maybe, or let's not put so much effort into pursuing this opportunity?
Well, I used to go to every conference pre-pandemic. I'd go to 25, 30 a year, and I'd ask the site. My main goal of going was to talk with other sites, which isn't generally why sites go to conferences, but I would ask them, what's your favorite study you're working on right now? And why is it your favorite? And what's your least favorite? And when you ask people what their favorite anything is, you tend to get a response that you cannot identify with at all, right? It's like, what's your favorite bar? Well, I like that one because they have this beer I like, and that's, someone else says, well, I like it because it's close to my apartment. The answers are similarly unusual in the worlds of why studies are selected. And in 2016, I had this remarkable coincidence that the most prolific site in all of psychiatry, it's called Atlanta Center for Medical Research. I saw that they had taken on every trial I could see that had on clinicaltrials.gov, that known about publicly. They were a site on it. And I had taken on one trial that year. It was for treatment-resistant depression. I saw that ACMR hadn't taken that study. So I was confused here. And I knew this site is gigantic. They filmed some of Walking Dead season 1 over there in their hospital, right? Yeah. So I went up to their sort of business leadership and I introduced myself and how are you guys selecting studies? And why didn't you take this one? They said, well, you really are taking them for financial reasons, and that study didn't line up financially with what we're looking for. I said, I've been selecting studies the same way. And I looked at every study you guys had, and this was the only study that made sense to me.
Right. And
the method they were using is something that I think a lot of sites use to try to figure out what studies to take. They were looking at what their costs were for each participant they'd be recruiting. So they'd say, we need an hour of coordinator time. We need 30 minutes of PI time at visit 1. And then at visit 2, we need this much. They calculate it up throughout the study. They assign a value to what their coordinator time and PI time is worth, or their nurse time and their NP time. And then they took what the drug company was willing to pay them. And if the difference wasn't high enough, it didn't make sense for them to do the trial. And I said, oh, well, I'm not really thinking about it that way. I'm trying to learn how the rest of the world runs businesses. And what they tend to do is they take the cost to acquire a customer, and then they look at sort of what the lifetime value achieved by getting that customer is. And they assess what the ratio is. And the lower the ratio, the better, right? And I saw this trial as one that was easy to recruit, that paid out some enormous sum for each person, because it was 3 times a week visits that went eventually down to once a week for years.
Yeah, that's a lot of visits.
Yeah, a lot of visits. And I couldn't really, in looking at how other sites calculated and how I did, the real reality is that this site I was talking to was about 40 times bigger than my site. Profitable, they sold, they're making millions and millions, doing great. So my answer isn't necessarily the right one, but it's what made sense to me in how to build things. So I don't think sites really take into account when picking studies how costly it is to find each participant. Part of that's because it's really tough to calculate for sites. I mean, if you're recruiting from some basis other than advertising, what are your costs to get each participant? And the thing that made, I think, running my business simpler is that we recruit our participants solely from advertising. So we place many millions of dollars on Facebook ads every year, and then have a team of people who call up anyone who applies, educates them about clinical trials, encourages them to come in person. And then once they show up in person, they meet with a doctor, and the doctor makes an assessment of whether that person should screen for the trial or not. And it's made it a lot easier for me to quantify which trials are worth taking than other sites, because you're just ballparking things as best you can, especially if you're taking from a wide variety of illnesses, because you're less familiar with each one than I am with a couple of illnesses I work on.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation, and certainly something I've experienced. It's challenging to. It feels very imprecise at the least. It seems very imprecise to be able to sort of calculate that, especially again as you stretch across new therapeutic areas, new indications, whatever the case may be. So, I mean, again, very, very interesting observation, and again, sort of makes perfect sense, but has been, still sort of, even for me, still sort of counterintuitive, as opposed to like, I still feel like everything is such a shotgun approach, which works sometimes, but it's certainly, the hit rate is very low. So let me ask you this: does Facebook tend to be your most best ROI in terms of advertising? And also, how much, we do Facebook, certainly not to the scale that you do, but I mean, it's like, still feels like needle in a haystack sometimes. It's a very, very arduous sometimes to deal with those leads.
Yeah. The thing I feel like I've done that one may call innovative is that I'm taking business practices from the rest of the world that were invented and widely established 20 years ago, and trying to put them in place at my company. And they're game changers for research, right? So I found a couple of guys who ran a marketing firm that really did. They found applicants who were interested in being for-profit colleges. They would do the ads themselves, and then they would sell those leads to the schools that were trying to convince them to come in. And I talked with them about what we do in research, and I had them do some basic advertising for me, and show me sort of the tricks of how best to place Facebook ads, and what sort of information you'd want to put in them. The answer's as little information as possible, right? And an image, and then you deal with someone either in person or over the phone. But I learned how to take that approach, and they said the key principle of this whole thing, something called speed to lead. And if you aren't calling someone within 5 minutes of their applying, throw away your money.
Right.
And we were we felt like we had this robust operation. We were doing like an 8-hour average to get in touch with people, which crushes the typical site, right?
Right, true.
But we presented at conferences now a fair bit about what the difference is between 5 minutes and 4 hours and 4 days. and it's enormous. So the needle in a haystack, the longer you wait to reach someone, if you wait more than 5-6 hours, might as well wait 5 days. It doesn't make that much of a difference on your likelihood of reaching them. If you call within 5 minutes, almost half of them pick up the phone. A huge portion of people are eligible for the right trial you're posting. And I work on very common chronic illnesses, depression, early Alzheimer's disease. These aren't needle in a haystack illnesses, right? They're horrible epidemic level illnesses, actually.
Sure.
So it seems like it should be findable, and it is, but it's all about how taking these normal business practices and following up with people right away properly.
Yeah, that's fair. And I will say, when I was earlier on in my business, I've only been, running sites here for not even quite 5 years yet, but we had a study where we still had very few staff, very few studies, so we could focus very well, kind of to your point. And they ran some central campaigns, very well targeted, and they included warm handoffs to the sites. And so we were up against, Mayo clinics and big UCLA, big centers, and we're some little ambulatory surgery center in Oklahoma City. And we crushed the other sites because we took every single warm lead as it was coming in with no gap in between. And they were very transparent with us with these other sites. They would wait 3 days. And I think, again, that's very, very underappreciated for a lot of research sites that, they're gone. You might as well not even bother. If you're not following up immediately, then you are doing yourself a ridiculous disservice. And again, that's may seem like a small thing, but again, I think just ridiculously underappreciated.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unexamined publicly aspect of this industry, what participant recruitment firms do, right? And they're paid differently than sites are. Sites have this cost plus pricing model. Recruitment firms are one of the only pieces of this whole industry that are really sink or swim, supply and demand pricing. I respect the people who put their careers into that, because it's not easy to always have someone know how well you did at your job the next day, but there's a nice aspect to the fact that their incentives line up pretty nicely with site incentives.
Right.
So, and on trials, I did a trial once in pediatric depression, where for every participant we found and tested a drug on, something like $20,000 that we got over the course of 8 weeks of putting a participant through a trial. And I found out the recruitment firm was getting $100,000 for every person they referred to us who got in. And my reaction, immediately you might have a reaction of being resentful, but in fact, this recruitment firm and I worked really well together, and I made them a lot of money. They made me a lot of money, and we it might have been a different amount of money, but we also helped test something that needed to be tested for society and for this drug company to get a 6-month patent extension, right? So the whole experience taught me that, you can just ask these companies, how do I rank compared to your other sites working on this? What do you recommend? And you sort of have to talk to someone who's willing to talk back and give you some insight, but plenty of them are, and because their incentives line up pretty well with yours. The only place they differ a bit is that sites are not paid a lump sum at randomization, right? Like recruitment firms are. So the further we did a little poster presentation on this, the further away someone is from your site, the more likely they are to drop out of a study early. We did this in depression studies. I'd assume it holds true for other illnesses, but didn't test it. And it's a pretty clear difference. The further away you are, the more likely you are to drop out. Recruitment firms don't care. I mean, they want to increase the radius of advertising around your site. And it's a place where the sponsor and the site have the right incentives, and the recruitment firm's a little bit off. But it's where you can figure things out. It's also where I got more interested in DCTs and what was going on in that space, because after I presented this poster, I talked with Science 37, and they use my data when they present now on the harms of how recruitment really works, that these subjects come from, even if they're willing to come from 50 miles away, they're way more likely to drop out than the people nearby. And that data isn't even collected by pharma right now. Who's far away, who's close.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to take this opportunity to segue into the DCT space a little bit. And, anybody out there, you're listening, feel free to comment. Nelson Rutrick here, CEO of Adams Clinical. I see you in the DTRA, clubhouse conversations, and I try to sit in on those when I can. I'm usually like multitasking, but a lot of talk, a lot of cool companies joining the space. I feel like it's not always the most practical conversations in the world, but where do you see the intersection of sites and these new DCT methodologies? Like what makes sense to you and what's real? And it still seems sort of to be determined in some ways. What are your thoughts there?
There's a few things that are valuable for us to look at when sort of assessing it, but because I'm not a doctor, I have a limited skill set that's valuable to this industry, right? I also don't have an MBA. I read dummies books to learn about accounting and finance. So what I'm good at is looking at public records. So I have appreciated that one company in the DCT space, Science 37, is publicly traded and explains what they're doing and how the industry is going every 3 months. And a big advantage this space has is that Craig Lipset and Amir Kalali, sort of the founders, of DTRA, are incredibly eloquent and direct and valuable to the whole industry in putting together everybody's thoughts and navigating the whole thing. And I was interested in the space because of the poster I had done on distance, but further, maybe it's because I'm in the business of testing stuff against other stuff and seeing which is better. But I was fascinated to see that the first trial that I'm aware of in which there was one trial that was fully virtual and another trial almost identical to it, tiny differences, almost identical. There was a standard brick and mortar study, happened to be an adjunctive major depressive disorder, which is the only illness I was testing drugs for.
That's your wheelhouse, right?
Yeah. So it got me more involved in looking over what was going on. And as soon as the study was about to get underway, I reached out to Science 37 and I said to them, I think virtual trials are going to much more quickly recruit participants in a lot of illnesses than sites can ever do. And I think really outside of illnesses is where it can be wildly fast in healthy people. But further, in things that aren't that scary, in a little blood draw or something, people are very willing to do. And there's no better way to reach them than a national advertising campaign. Reduces your costs, gets people who don't have access to a nearby site. Startup is faster, but I said that this illness they had picked, second line adjunctive major depressive disorder, was like a horrible choice. I mean, even psychiatry is totally fine. I think most of psychiatry will go the way of being easier to recruit virtually. But doing a second line study where someone must have tried and currently be on a certain drug is brutal to do. And I gave them the example when I had never worked with an imaging facility before. I didn't really know anything about it. And then I started doing neurology trials a couple of years ago. And I call up my local imaging center, one of the local imaging centers, and said, interested in getting a quote and hearing a little more. Okay. think we signed up on their website to hear a little more. Okay? I get a call from a coordinator in my office. They said, Nelson, you mind coming to the waiting room? Okay. Come to the waiting room. There's a salesman there from the imaging center. He says he happened to be in the building and wanted to talk to me about what they sell at their imaging facility. Okay. And that's how sales in normal life work, right? It's way easier to convince someone to do something scary when you're able to see them and interact with them and talk in person. That's why conferences are in person, right? I think that the studies with approved drugs and with that are safer bets overall, less scary for participants, there's no way brick and mortar anything will compete with it, I feel like. But there's a whole host of things that we test which aren't so safe and sound. And
Okay.
I listen to the quarterly earnings calls of all the CROs and what they think of the space. And, Steve Cutler at Icon gets asked, aren't you worried about DCTs destroying the money you make here? I mean, isn't this a real threat? And he goes, I don't think it's going to affect the bottom line here, right? It's a tiny fraction of the trials we see, less than 1%. So don't be worried about our quarterly earnings. And that's sort of the sense I think the industry has, that there's, yes, over time, these trials will get picked off. These illnesses will get picked off one by one for different elements of fully virtual trials or different aspects of DCTs that are valuable. But
well, to that end, do you feel like that? I don't disagree with that. I do feel like it's a relatively smaller amount of trials that are going to be really well suited, but look at the valuations and investment dollars flowing into some of these companies. I mean, are those two things, those two things match up to you, or do you think there's just going to be a slaughter at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I joke with pharma, the name of my company should be Adams Clinical Cemetery, where everyone's best ideas come to die. Right? Because at least in psychiatry and neurology, everything I test is the best idea that got hundreds of millions or billions of dollars invested into it and then doesn't seem to work. And it works in 100 people, 200 people, and it just doesn't work in 1,000. There's not really a good explanation. We have theories, but there's a lot of ideas that just seem like they can work and don't pan out, which is why we have to test things and really see if our preliminary data holds true. So I'm a big believer in us testing stuff. For my staff, we used to do it much more pre-pandemic, but we'd get dumplings from 10 different restaurants, and we make our own rating scale, and everyone would judge which dumplings were the best, right? Nice. And on different items. And it's sort of fun to have the process of really testing something and seeing how people feel about it in a blinded way.
Sure. I like that. So let's let's have one question here. And, question about other avenues other than Facebook. Are there things that have been successful for you aside? I mean, I'm sure there are things other than Facebook, but I guess even when some of the presentations I've seen, it seems to outpace just about every other, media. But can you comment at all on anything that's been particularly successful?
I guess I'd say first, Meta, right, owns Facebook and Instagram. Those are the 95% of clinical trial recruitment. Google Ads has the problem here that people have to be searching for something related to your trial in order to see the ad. And further, Google Ads are great for businesses that are not geographically restricted. Whereas for my company, the only participants we sign up are ones that live within a couple hundred miles of Boston. So there isn't really a way to make those work at the same scale. But in terms of outside of that, approach that I've seen work to some degree, and I personally haven't used it, is paying doctors or paying participants to refer their friends or refer their patients. And there's some legal nuance to both of these things, and both require IRB approval to some capacity. But they're kosher if done properly. So it's not something we've really invested in. I got a legal opinion once on what I was allowed to do. The thing we learn as lawyers is to ask other lawyers for help. So I figured out how to do that, but nothing compares to the scalability of online advertising. As you do more and more, it just makes you feel bad for newspapers and realize magazines
Right.
never coming back, considering how much the yield is on ad placement compared to any other venue.
Well, you picked out something else that's been of a lot of interest to me, and how, or I mean, something you may or may not have experience with, how to engage with referring physicians in a way that's incentivizing but not unethical, right? Because we all know, you've approached other physicians about referrals, and a lot of them will be like, yeah, cool, we'll keep an eye out and send some patients over, which never really happens unless somebody's really poking them with a stick. And I've seen different methods. Well, we can, maybe we can pay them for the time spent helping pre-screen patients, make an hourly rate, so we're not paying them for referrals. Or I guess kind of I've never seen that nut truly cracked in a very effective way. Is that something that
Well, there's a couple companies that do it, right? I mean, there's CyteRx, which really runs Alzheimer's trials now. They create financial relationships with physicians who refer their patients to be in industry-sponsored trials. But there's state laws governing this topic. There's state and federal medical organizations and specialty organizations that govern it. But the gist of things, so far as I learned, was that it can't be outcome-based payments, right? But they have to be disclosed. But there's ways to do this properly and figure it out. It's just tough to do. And I found online advertising to be so much easier that, and already the nut has already been cracked.
Sure.
That I didn't invest the same resources in it. Now, online advertising caps about age 77 or so. And then there's 70, even at 75, plummeting in the users who are using social media. So there's a bunch of trials that are targeting people above that age on average. And
Sure.
They have to look for an uncracked nut to get their trial recruited. But I've always sort of laughed at this idea that it would be unethical to pay an outside doctor to refer their patients, but you can pay the principal investigator to refer theirs, right? I mean,
Right.
The questions here are really about how it's best laid out, and are you paying for their time for the screening? Because yada yada yada, and all of this needs to be disclosed to people. But that's different than barring it when the one time I visited PPD's site, biggest site, I got to see they give out a flyer that says get $50 if you refer a friend to be in a clinical trial. And it's a major tactic used by big sites, big CROs, and it's something to consider.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I was at Magi a couple of weeks ago and spoke there, and I sat in on the session right before mine, and that was a slide someone had thrown up as referral bonuses to patients. And it's really interesting that it was like the room was split in half, between half the room saying, oh, you can't do that, that's unethical, and the other half saying, well, sure you can. So I think, again, there's all this sort of weird, at least perceived, contention in these things that always kind of just strike me as funny,
Yeah, I mean, I took a picture of the flyer when I found it at PBD's site, and I gave the picture to friends who were interested in doing the same thing, and um, it this whole process is doable. People just don't ask enough, and the main thing I've done in this industry outside of adopting technology from 20 years ago is I've visited maybe 100 different sites. And I think very few people who work at the site level have visited other sites. I ask every CRA who comes by my site to any sites in particular they thought were really interesting or unusual that they've been monitoring at. And I felt like a barber who every time I was traveling to another city, I'd get 3 haircuts. And I asked them about their hair products and what margin they had on them. And because I only do outpatient research and I do late phase research, the field is just so amateur and uncompetitive that people are happy to help one another. And I've tried to remain Switzerland here and avoid getting into the competitive space of inpatient research, which is cutthroat, and the sites all hate each other.
Sure.
And and as they should, as competitive businesses, right? But I've kept friendly with sites as a result.
No, I mean, I love that. I think we do have a lot to learn from each other. I want to hit on one other thing as we kind of come up on the end of the hour, and something I know you've brought up a few times is sort of the all the M&A in this space and sort of consolidation in the site space and what effect that has. Or I guess I'm kind of curious to hear more about your thoughts. I know it's something you've brought up, but I just kind of want to pick your brain about what do you think about the consolidation on the sites, and on top of that, I mean, some of these emerging well-funded IROs, I guess they're calling themselves. I mean, what do you think that affects? I mean, what effects are we going to see by these these things?
Yeah, I mean, there's several multi-billion. There's 3 sites worth over $1 billion now. There's I made a list of every time a site had ever been bought, and looked up the article, and there's about 300 publicly noted times that a site's been acquired. There hasn't been a publicly traded site since Synexus went private in 2007, right? That made the majority of its revenue from being a site. But there was a time when there were some big sites, and a couple of them went bankrupt. They got acquired by Kinderhook, which owns SCRS and Virtrial and Synexus, Radiant. And bankruptcy records are public. So I was able to learn a little bit about the M&A space from diving into this stuff. But I've seen research about the bad, mostly, of what private equity can do to an industry. I think that the real benefit of them consolidating sites is that sites are so bad. It's like crazy how amateur and horrible sites are on average. And even if I haven't seen any PE firm professionalize a site yet, even though they've been around for years, what they've done is they've consolidated and they've given one point of contact to pharma to deal with on their trials. And that alone, I think, will just eliminate the site startup problem, which is a big problem the industry faces, that it's so difficult just to get a trial launched and add sites to it. And I think PE firms have very low-hanging fruit here that they can eliminate that. It's an issue. And I think that's it's going to be a different world of how things look when there's when that's gone, and companies can just deal with one contact at least. I don't think the operations at any sites are really changing though.
Sure.
And it's not the model of PE exactly to change everyone and make them more efficient, right? They're changing the back office, but these places look the same.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, look, I spend a lot of time complaining about sponsors and CROs and vendors, but you've pointed out, I mean, a lot of sites are just shitty. They don't do a good job in a lot of ways, right?
Well, and I think they're much shittier than sponsors and CROs and vendors on average, right?
Yeah,
Which is tough to say given that I'm a site, right? But I don't even think it's that close. Your chance of getting an email back or a phone call back from any of those entities is sky high compared to your chance of getting it back when you apply to be in a clinical trial at a site or want to work with a site. And that has to do with just the professionalism of the company, and it varies a lot site to site, of course, but it means that at every conference pharma goes to that's for pharma, the topic is, how do you find a half decent site? After site number 30, your trial needs 300. Oh God, like site 31 is so bad, let alone site 231. And it's a lot tougher to be a drug company. You have to make a drug that works, and you have to babysit all these sites than it is to be a site.
Sure.
I think we have the easier end of the industry.
I mean, why do you think exactly that is? I mean, and look, I'll say this even about us. Like, there are some studies where, I mean, the sponsor probably thinks we're great, professional, have all of our shit together. We look great. And then there's studies where we look bad. We don't do a good job. I mean, it can be tough to remain consistent, due to a number of factors, both in and outside our control. But I mean, more broadly speaking, I mean, why are sites so bad? I mean, obviously there's people doing it and doing it well enough to, make a living and do very well in some instances. But how do those two things sort of jive? You know what I mean?
I think sites are dramatically understaffed, and they're used to the industry norm that there's one coordinator per 4 studies, something like that.
I think that's pretty generous even.
Yeah. And I run 4, maybe 5 soon enrolling trials. I have about 35 full-time coordinators. And it's just a different system of how I think staffing makes sense to do. And you hear about sites complaining about their logins. How come you never hear a CRO complain about having logins? They have to log in all the same systems, right? Have you ever heard someone at a CRO complain that they have to log into the IVRS and the EDC and they have to check this? No,
Sure.
right? Because it's first, they're not assigned to 20 different trials. They're assigned to 1 or 2. Okay, so they have a much more limited scope of their job here. And when you get more professional about this, you either ascend to a level where you don't have to do it yourself, so you stop complaining about it because you're not doing it,
right?
Or you lump it and just figure it out. And I think it's interesting to see that the CROs are never the ones complaining about logins.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, they also are, multi-billion-dollar industries, and CRAs are well paid.
Yeah, but I haven't heard CRAs complain to me about having too many logins. Right?
Fair.
Maybe it happens. Fair. I've listened to a lot of Dan Sfera podcasts with CRAs. They're not complaining about the logins.
That's
right?
True. That is true. You're not wrong. Yeah. No, you're not wrong. And so let me ask you this too. I mean, what you're doing is perfectly intuitive. It makes amazing sense to me. Do you attribute, the success or the ability to operate that way due to the high volume of advertising? Because it sounds like all your leads are coming from it. So a combination of choosing the right trials and really going all in on the advertising. Is it possible sites just aren't spending enough on advertising? Is that?
Yeah, I started paying for taxis for participants in that opiate addiction trial, even though the sponsor wouldn't reimburse me, because I saw that the cost of providing the taxi, which was like $70 on average per visit, dramatically increased the likelihood someone showed to their visit. And that meant money for me. So yes, it was in the drug company's financial interest to pay for it, but they wouldn't. Doesn't mean I'm not going to do it, right? And when you see an ad for anything, it's almost never reimbursed, right? The point of ads is they cost less than they cost less money than the revenue you're bringing in from the ad.
Right. Yep.
So I think that sites definitely should do that. And what I found as I grew in scale is that pharma was willing to reimburse me in the same way they reimbursed recruitment firms, so long as it was related to the spend I was putting down, right? It sort of varies company to company, but I tend to have a provision in my budgets now, all of them for the last couple of years, that say, okay, upon randomizing a participant in your trial, reimburse me for up to $30,000 in Facebook invoices that I spent on advertising.
Sure.
For each participant I randomize, right? Which is not the model sites typically do, but it tends to be a lot cheaper than using a recruitment firm, because recruitment firms have to both advertise, cajole and babysit sites to follow up on the leads and make a profit. What I'm able to do as a site is simply advertise and do it at a break even. And then my profit comes from the overhead I receive on running studies. So the strategy I use is I advertise at real scale on Facebook, Instagram, Google Ads. I have people who want to become doctors doing the initial call, encouraging 80 or so % of them to come in. And once they show up, I have them meet with a doctor, and the doctor makes the decision. So the doctors at my site do oversight, physicals, and interview people for pre-screen. Right? It's a little different than how the typical model works. And
sure.
And
I mean,
I
want to say, and to go back a little bit too, I mean, because this is something that again occurs to me a lot. I mean, and I've been guilty of bitching about it, but like, sites don't want to do anything that doesn't have an immediate reimbursement from a sponsor, even though, investing is good for you as the site, even if you're spending your own money. And maybe you said this or not, but frankly, the ROI for Facebook advertising is pretty easy to achieve. It's easy to achieve a pretty good ROI. Even if, if you spend a few $1,000s and you get one patient, you've probably tripled your ROI right there, for most studies. But do you feel, I feel like I've observed that like most sites don't invest in themselves in that way, or are afraid to sort of throw their own money around,
Yeah, I benefited from having a friend with a much bigger business than I had, who talked with me about what I was doing and said, "You're crazy for not advertising. Look at these numbers. This is like, it's so easy to find people living with these horrible illnesses who are interested in this. Why aren't you advertising? What do you mean reimbursed? Nobody gets reimbursed for their ads."
Right.
And he sells ice cream and not clinical trials, but it was a different, it was the same principle. And a benefit from it, which has come to the forefront now that a few companies have run trials with almost no Black or Hispanic participants in them, is that Zuckerberg, for all of the criticism of Meta, it's not discriminating, right? You get a totally proportionate representation of the area you're advertising in, of all different sorts of people. So I got asked, am I going to churches to find Black participants for these studies? It's like, no, I'm a Jew. I'm not going to churches to find people for studies. I'm simply using Facebook, and it produces a normal representative sample. So the problem for diversity in clinical trials isn't really across the board. It's just in a few illnesses, but it's really bad in those illnesses. So psychiatry, there's almost no talk of it. Trials are overrepresented with Black and Hispanic participants for the most part. But in Alzheimer's, there's barely any participants who are Black or Hispanic. So it's shown through there that it's been valuable to use Facebook ads. So
fair. Well, we're getting low on time here.
Yeah.
I've got to jump to another call, but where can people find you online, Nelson?
They can find me on LinkedIn, I guess. That's the best place to reach me. And and then I give out my cell phone, and I pick it up even when it's an unknown number. I'm a old man in
You're brave. You're
an
brave.
average aged man's body. So happy to answer your random cold calls and talk more about what we do. And yeah, thanks for having me on, Brad. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, absolutely. I'm sorry, you guys, I did not get to some of these questions, but I've got to jump. But I'll try to follow up on the back end and maybe get some answers from Nelson as well. But thanks, guys. Until next time.